In the mid-14th century, Europe faced one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, the Black Plague, also known as the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, this devastating disease swept across the continent, killing an estimated 25 to 30 million people, roughly one-third of Europe's population at the time. But what if the Black Plague had never occurred? How would Europe have developed socially, economically, politically, and culturally if this catastrophic event had been avoided? To understand the full implications of a Europe untouched by the plague, it is essential to consider the state of the continent before the outbreak. Cities were growing rapidly, trade networks expanded across the Mediterranean and northern Europe, and population levels had reached unprecedented highs. Feudalism structured rural life, while monarchies and emerging city-states competed for power, wealth, and influence. Cultural life was flourishing, with Gothic architecture reaching new heights and universities becoming centers of learning and debate. Had the plague never struck, the balance between population, economy, and social structures would have followed a dramatically different trajectory. First, consider the demographic consequences. The plague reduced the European population by roughly one-third. Entire villages disappeared. Towns lost thousands of residents, and labor forces were decimated. Without the plague, the population would have continued its rapid growth. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris would have faced extreme pressure on housing, sanitation, and food supply. The absence of such a massive population reduction would have meant more competition for land and resources, potentially exacerbating social tensions between peasants and landowners. Urban infrastructure would have struggled to accommodate the burgeoning population, leading to overcrowded cities and an increase in poverty, but also potentially stimulating innovation in agriculture, trade, and city planning sooner than in our historical timeline. Economically, the Black Plague had profound and paradoxical effects. Labor shortages following the plague empowered peasants and workers, allowing them to demand higher wages and better living conditions. Feudal obligations weakened, contributing to social mobility, and in some regions, the decline of the feudal system. In a world without the plague, this labor pressure would not have emerged. Feudal lords would have retained more control over their serfs and peasants, potentially delaying the decline of feudalism. Urban economies may have grown more slowly in some respects, as the lack of labor scarcity would limit wage growth and reduce the incentive for technological innovations, such as mechanized agriculture or more efficient manufacturing processes. On the other hand, a larger population could have stimulated more trade, larger markets, and faster urbanization, which might have driven economic complexity and the growth of merchant classes even earlier than in our historical timeline. Socially, the plague induced a profound cultural and psychological shift. The trauma of the Black Death reshaped art, literature, and philosophy. Themes of mortality and the fragility of life dominated paintings, literature, and religious thought. Without the plague, these cultural shifts would have been delayed or expressed differently. Gothic art and architecture would have developed along alternate trajectories, perhaps focusing more on grandeur, civic pride, and religious devotion rather than the pervasive motifs of death and suffering. Universities and centers of learning might have seen uninterrupted growth, producing earlier scientific advances without the social disruptions caused by massive mortality. However, some reforms in medicine, sanitation, and public health might have been postponed, as the urgency created by the plague's devastation accelerated the development of public health awareness in certain regions. Politically, Europe would have experienced a very different evolution. Monarchies and states weakened by the massive loss of life had to adapt, often granting concessions to peasants or restructuring tax systems to account for diminished populations. Without the plague, centralized power structures might have strengthened more quickly. Kings and city-states would have faced larger, healthier populations demanding resources, taxes, and representation. Wars, territorial expansions, and state building could have proceeded with a more robust manpower base, potentially changing the outcome of key historical conflicts, such as the Hundred Years' War or the expansion of the Ottoman Empire into Eastern Europe. Religion, too, would have taken a different path. The Black Death prompted both deep piety and widespread skepticism. Many viewed the plague as divine punishment, leading to social upheavals, persecution of minority groups, and questioning of religious authority. Without the plague, religious institutions might have retained more unchallenged influence for longer, shaping Europe's spiritual and moral landscape in ways that could have delayed secularization and reform movements such as the Protestant Reformation. However, a continuously growing population and urban centers could have eventually led to different tensions between traditional religious authority and the needs of increasingly complex societies. Scientific and medical development would also have diverged. The Black Plague accelerated the study of medicine and epidemiology as society struggled to understand and respond to mass mortality. Without such a crisis, the urgency to develop public health measures, quarantine practices, and medical knowledge would have been less pronounced. On the other hand, uninterrupted population growth, trade, and urbanization might have created alternative pressures for medical and scientific innovation, potentially advancing knowledge in different directions, perhaps even earlier in some areas. Culturally, Europe may have experienced a different renaissance. The labor shortages following the plague contributed to the wealth accumulation of certain merchant classes and reshaped patronage patterns for art and architecture. Without the plague, the Renaissance might have unfolded with alternate social actors dominating cultural production, possibly accelerating in some regions and delaying in others. Major cities with uninterrupted populations, such as Florence or Venice, might have seen more continuous growth in artistic and scientific achievements, creating a Europe where innovation was driven by larger populations and more competitive urban centers, rather than the unique circumstances of post-plague social mobility. In the broader perspective, global consequences are also conceivable. The Black Plague indirectly influenced European exploration and colonization by altering population pressures, labor availability, and economic priorities. Without it, migration patterns within Europe as well as colonization efforts abroad might have shifted. Larger European populations could have fueled more intensive agricultural expansion, urban development, and resource extraction, changing the timing and nature of encounters with other continents and civilizations. The demographic and economic patterns in Asia, Africa, and the Americas could have been affected indirectly, altering trade networks, colonial ambitions, and cultural exchanges. In conclusion, a Europe untouched by the Black Plague would have been dramatically different. Population growth would have continued unabated, creating pressures on resources, housing, and urban infrastructure. Feudal structures might have persisted longer, delaying certain social transformations, while trade and urbanization could have accelerated elsewhere. Culturally, art, literature, and science would have followed different trajectories, reflecting alternative social dynamics and psychological priorities. Politically, monarchies and city-states might have strengthened more quickly, shaping the balance of power in Europe in ways difficult to predict. Religion, too, medicine, and global exploration would have unfolded differently, producing a Europe simultaneously familiar and profoundly altered from the one we know. The Black Plague, devastating though it was, became a catalyst for change, accelerating social, economic, and cultural transformations. Its absence would have left Europe more stable in the short term, but perhaps slower to evolve in ways that ultimately shaped the modern world. This scenario reminds us of the complex interplay between catastrophe and progress, and how the darkest moments of history can sometimes be the engines of long-term change.